When my father's health began to decline, the world inside our home shifted in ways I could not have anticipated, as though the very walls of the house were holding their breath, waiting for something dark to reveal itself. My father, a man who had worked tirelessly all his life, building both a business and a reputation for fairness and discipline, had always been the anchor of our family. He was the kind of man who believed in integrity, who taught us that one's word should mean more than any piece of paper, and that loyalty to family was sacred above all. But as his strength faltered and his voice grew weaker, those values were suddenly put to the test, and cracks began to appear in the people around us, cracks that revealed greed, envy, and betrayal simmering just beneath the surface. My cousin Clara, who had always hovered on the edges of our family gatherings with her carefully practiced smiles and saccharine tone, suddenly transformed into a constant presence once father became bedridden. At first, her visits seemed generous, even touching. She would come by with baskets of fruit, trays of home-cooked meals, and books she claimed father would enjoy being read to. She tucked blankets around him, adjusted his pillows, and whispered soft words into his ear whenever she thought no one else was paying attention. My siblings welcomed her presence, convinced she was simply showing compassion. But something about the way her eyes lingered too long on father's desk, the way her hands brushed across his papers as though they belonged to her, unsettled me. I told myself I was being paranoid, that stress and grief were painting Clara in a harsher light than she deserved. But deep inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that her intentions were not as innocent as they seemed. Father had already written a will years before, and he had made it abundantly clear to us what it contained. His estate, which included the family home, the business he had built with his bare hands, and the land that had been in our name for generations, was to be divided fairly among his children, with a small, thoughtful portion set aside for extended family members like Clara, who had no claim but was still considered part of our bloodline. He had spoken of it often, not to boast, but to reassure us that when the time came, there would be no fighting, no confusion, no reason for bitterness among those he loved. Fairness is the only true legacy, he had told me once, as we walked through the orchard behind the house. Money can be wasted. Houses can crumble. But fairness, that is the foundation of trust. I believed him. And I clung to those words like scripture when the shadows around Clara grew darker. The first sign that something was amiss came one afternoon when I went into father's room to bring him his medicine. I found Clara at his desk, hurriedly tucking away papers into a folder. She looked up at me with a startled smile, her eyes flashing with something I couldn't quite name, and she said she was merely organizing things to ease father's burden. I wanted to believe her, but when I glanced at the papers later, I noticed strange corrections in father's familiar handwriting, except they didn't look quite like his. The letters were stiffer, the strokes too deliberate, as though someone were trying to mimic his style but lacked his natural ease with the pen. At the time, I dismissed it as father's trembling hands. After all, illness had weakened him, and even writing a grocery list was now a challenge. Yet the doubt stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. Days later, I noticed more oddities. Pages left out on the desk with dates that didn't make sense, names rearranged in lists of beneficiaries, and lines scratched out so violently that the paper tore. Father never worked in such a messy manner. His will, I knew, had been finalized years ago, and there was no reason for him to be reworking it now, especially in his condition. I told myself again that I was overthinking, that Clara was perhaps only tidying or helping father keep track of his affairs. But then came the evening that sealed my suspicions beyond doubt. I had gone downstairs to fetch a glass of water, the house silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. As I passed father's room, I saw a sliver of light spilling from beneath the door. Quietly, I pushed it open just enough to see Clara standing by the desk, sliding a folded document into her purse. Her movements were quick, furtive, and when she turned toward the bed, she whispered something to father in a tone so low I couldn't make out the words. Father, too weak to respond, closed his eyes, and Clara kissed his forehead as though she were the most devoted of daughters. My heart froze in my chest, my breath caught in my throat, and a chill swept through me so fierce it felt like ice in my veins. I knew then with a clarity that burned. Clara was tampering with his will, She was not here out of kindness or familial duty. She was here because greed had consumed her, because she saw in Father's illness an opportunity to claim for herself what she had never earned. I wanted to storm into the room, to snatch the purse from her hands, and expose her treachery right then and there. But something stopped me. Perhaps it was Father's fragile state, his need for peace and not conflict. Perhaps it was my instinct to gather proof before making accusations that could shatter what little stability we had left. So instead, I retreated silently into the shadows, my mind racing, my resolve hardening. I knew that from that moment forward, I had to watch Clara carefully, for her mask of compassion hid the venom of betrayal. And as I stood alone in the darkened hallway, the weight of my father's teachings pressed heavily on me. Fairness, integrity, trust. Clara had already violated them all, and I swore to myself then that I would protect his legacy no matter what it took, even if it meant facing my own family and tearing away the mask from the smiling viper who had slithered into our home. After Father passed away, the house fell into a silence so heavy it seemed to press down on every corner, suffocating us with the weight of absence. And while grief clung to me like a shroud, I couldn't ignore the strange confidence radiating from Clara during those first days of mourning, as if she had been waiting for this moment, as if behind her tear-stained handkerchief there was a smirk she could barely contain. She walked through the halls with a false air of ownership, rearranging flowers, directing neighbors where to set down food, speaking to relatives as though she were the rightful mistress of the home. And though my siblings tried to dismiss my unease as exhaustion and paranoia, I could feel in my bones that something was terribly wrong, that Clara's sudden sense of authority had roots deeper than grief or duty. The reading of the will was scheduled for the following week at Father's lawyer's office, and that day, as we filed into the room, I could barely steady my hands, while Clara strolled in wearing a perfectly pressed black dress and pearls that gleamed under the harsh light, sitting at the front as though she expected applause. The lawyer, an old friend of Father's named Mr. Hargrave, cleared his throat and began to unfold the documents. And the moment the words left his mouth, the floor beneath me seemed to disappear. According to the papers, my cousin Clara was now the primary heir, granted ownership of the house, the bulk of Father's savings, and even control of the family business, while my siblings and I were left with crumbs, mere tokens that mocked the fairness Father had promised us all our lives. My throat burned as I forced myself to speak, my voice trembling with both rage and disbelief. This isn't right. My father would never do this. But Clara turned her head toward me, her lips curling into a smile so cold it made my blood run colder, and she said in that sugary voice of hers, "Maybe he trusted me more than you think. Maybe he realized who truly cared for him in his final days." The gall of it, the shamelessness, nearly broke me. But beneath the fury there was resolve, because I knew my father, I knew his handwriting, his habits, his very soul, and nothing about this so-called will matched the man he had been. I refused to let Clara's deceit go unchallenged, so while my siblings wrestled with their shock, I gathered every ounce of determination I had and began my quiet investigation, starting with the documents themselves. I requested copies from Mr. Hargrave, who seemed uneasy himself, and when I held those pages in my hands, the ink still sharp and black against the paper, my heart pounded with recognition and dread, because though the signature bore my father's name, the strokes were wrong, the loops too stiff, the slant unnatural, like a mask imitating a face but never quite capturing its essence. I hired a handwriting expert, a stern woman named Dr. Reynolds, who examined the pages with a magnifying glass, tracing each letter, each pressure point with her finger before looking up at me and saying the words that both confirmed my fears and ignited my fury. "This is not authentic. The differences are subtle but undeniable. Your father did not sign this." Relief surged through me, but so did terror, because if Clara had gone so far as to forge Father's will, then this was not just dishonesty. It was a crime, one that she believed she could get away with because she thought no one would dare question her performance as the grieving relative. I pressed further, digging into the dates written on the supposed revisions of the will, and what I discovered made my skin crawl. Father had allegedly signed one of these changes on a day when he was in the hospital, his hands strapped with IV lines, barely conscious from the medication, and the nurses confirmed he had been in no state to hold a pen, much less draft legal documents. Each piece of evidence I gathered built a picture of Clara's cunning manipulation. Her visits timed to isolate father. Her whispers meant to plant ideas of distrust in him against his own children. Her subtle theft of documents from his desk when no one was watching. And though she might have thought herself clever, she had underestimated me. Underestimated the loyalty I had to father's memory, and the sharpness of my eyes that caught every inconsistency she left behind. The discovery of her betrayal tore at me, because it meant she had not only stolen from us, but she had desecrated the very trust father had placed in family, twisting his final days into an opportunity for selfish gain, and I could not, would not, let her walk away unchallenged. Night after night I pored over papers, cross-referencing dates with hospital records, gathering statements from staff who remembered father's weakened condition, consulting with legal advisors who all shook their heads at the blatant fraud in front of them, and each time I thought of Clara sitting smugly at the will reading, savoring the thought of her inheritance, it fueled me with a fire hotter than grief itself. I began to imagine the confrontation, the moment when her mask would crack under the weight of truth, the courtroom buzzing with whispers as her lies unraveled. But even as I longed for that reckoning, I also grieved for the fact that blood had turned against blood. That family could cut deeper than any stranger ever could. Still, I held to the promise I made myself the night I saw her slip those documents into her purse, that I would protect father's legacy, that I would honor the fairness he valued above all else, even if it meant dragging Clara's betrayal into the harshest light of justice, because she may have thought she could rewrite my father's will, but she would never rewrite the truth, and the truth was mine to wield. The day of the court hearing arrived like a storm that had been gathering on the horizon for weeks, and as I walked into the courthouse with my siblings at my side, I felt the weight of my father's legacy pressing down on my shoulders, steadying me, reminding me that this battle was not about greed or inheritance, but about truth, honor, and the protection of the fairness he had devoted his life to instilling in us. Clara, of course, made her entrance in the grandest way possible, striding into the room draped in an expensive black suit, her hair styled immaculately, pearls at her throat gleaming like trophies she had already claimed, her confidence radiating from her in smug waves as she glanced at the crowd, with a smile that suggested she believed victory was inevitable, that she would leave the courtroom not only with father's estate secured in her name, but with her image untarnished. The devoted cousin who had supposedly earned his trust above his own children, she sat at the front, crossing her legs with practiced poise, her lawyers murmuring reassurances in her ear, and for a moment I almost pitied her, because she had convinced herself so completely of her own invincibility that she did not see the trap tightening around her, the walls of truth that would close in until there was no escape. The judge entered, the room rising in silence, and as proceedings began, Clara's side presented their argument with confidence, insisting the revised will reflected father's true wishes, pointing to her supposed dedication in his final months, painting her as the angel of mercy, who had been there when his children were not. But as I listened, I felt no fear, only the quiet certainty of the evidence I held, evidence that would tear her story apart piece by piece. When it was my turn to speak, I rose slowly, deliberately, every eye in the room turning toward me, my hands gripping the folder that held the proof of Clara's betrayal. My voice, though steady, carried the weight of both grief and fury as I began to recount the truth, that my father had long ago finalized his will with fairness at its core, that Clara's sudden prominence in his life coincided suspiciously with his decline, that documents had surfaced bearing signatures that did not match his authentic hand, and that dates recorded on those revisions aligned with times when he had been hospitalized, too weak to even lift a pen, let alone draft legal amendments. The first blow came with the testimony of Dr. Reynolds, the handwriting expert, who spoke with clinical precision, pointing to the inconsistencies in the forged signatures, explaining to the court how the pressure points did not align with father's natural writing, how the slant and curvature betrayed a different hand. And as she spoke, I saw Clara's smile flicker, a crack appearing in her mask of confidence. The second blow landed with the hospital records, which proved beyond doubt that father had been incapacitated on the dates listed. Nurses and doctors testifying that he had been unconscious, sedated or physically incapable of signing anything at all. And this time Clara shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her pearls no longer a crown of triumph, but a chain tightening around her neck. The third and final blow was delivered by a notary, a man Clara had attempted to bribe into validating the forged will, who now stood in court, his conscience finally outweighing his fear. recounting how she had approached him with promises of money and influence if he would look the other way. The room buzzed with whispers, gasps echoing against the wooden walls, and Clara's face paled as though the ground beneath her had vanished. The judge listened intently, his stern gaze shifting from Clara to the evidence, from the testimony to the forged documents, and finally, after what felt like an eternity of silence, he declared the so-called revised will invalid, restoring Father's original will and his true wishes, granting me and my siblings the inheritance he had always intended us to have, while Clara was left with nothing. No house, no land, no business, not even the sliver of respectability she had tried to cling to. But the reckoning did not end there. The judge announced that an investigation into Clara's forgery and attempted fraud would be opened immediately. Her actions not only immoral but criminal. And as those words rang out, Clara's carefully constructed facade shattered entirely, her lips trembling, her eyes wide with a mixture of rage and fear, her body sinking into the chair as though all the air had been sucked from the room. I stood tall, not with arrogance but with the pride of a child who had defended his father's name, his teachings, his legacy, and as I looked at Clara, I felt no sympathy. Only the cold satisfaction of justice served, because she had tried to rewrite my father's will, to steal not only what was rightfully ours, but also the very essence of his fairness. And instead, she had rewritten her own downfall, ensuring her name would forever be tainted by disgrace. When we left the courthouse, the sunlight outside seemed brighter than it had in weeks, washing over me with warmth that felt like Father's approval. And though grief still lingered, it was tempered by the knowledge that his wishes had been honored, his legacy preserved. Beside me, my siblings walked with renewed strength, their faces no longer shadowed by doubt, but lifted by vindication. While behind us, Clara stumbled out of the courthouse, pale and hollow, her expensive suit suddenly nothing more than a costume stripped of meaning, her eyes burning with humiliation and fury as whispers followed her down the steps, whispers that would haunt her long after the courtroom walls had closed on her schemes. She had played her game, woven her lies, worn her mask of devotion, but in the end, truth had torn it all away, and she was left with nothing but the ashes of her greed, while we, though scarred by betrayal, stood together, carrying forward Father's true legacy of fairness and integrity, a legacy no forgery could ever erase.